Clara was 46 years old when this photograph was taken. She had been free for 33 years, but her hands still carried the scars of the 13 years before that, the years when she and her two younger sisters had worked the rice fields of a Georgia plantation as children. Some of them had been as young as 4 years old. This photograph was supposed to document those scars. What it captured was something else entirely. This 1898 studio portrait sat in a cardboard box in a Savannah attic for over a century. It passed through estate sales and forgotten storage rooms, nearly discarded twice. When a historian named Thomas Bennett digitally enhanced the image to examine the sisters' scarred hands more closely, he found something in the background that made him stop working for the rest of the day. A fourth figure, standing behind the three seated sisters, a woman who, according to every historical record, had been dead for 36 years when this photograph was taken. By minute 8, you'll read the letters these sisters left behind, their own words describing what happened to their hands and why they chose to display the scars. By minute 15, you'll see the plantation records that listed them as children, with dollar values next to their names. And by minute 25, you'll watch a living descendant see this photograph for the first time and recognize her own face in a woman born into slavery over 170 years ago. This is a story about testimony, about three women who survived one of the most brutal labor systems in American history and chose to document their scars so that future generations could never deny what slavery truly cost. It's also a story about what happens when technology reveals something that was always there, hidden in plain sight for 126 years. Let me show you exactly what Thomas Bennett found when he enhanced this photograph. And let me tell you who these women were, what they survived, and why the fourth figure in this image has left researchers without a rational explanation. It starts with the hands. The photograph shows three African-American women seated in a formal studio arrangement. The sepia tones have aged to a warm amber, but the image remains remarkably clear, a testament to the skill of whoever developed it over a century ago. They wear dark dresses with high collars and long sleeves, modest, dignified, the kind of Sunday-best clothing that working people saved for important occasions, carefully maintained and brought out only when something mattered. Small matching brooches sit at each woman's collar, possibly gifts, perhaps chosen specifically for this portrait. A detail that speaks to coordination, to planning, to deliberate preparation. Their expressions are serious, unsmiling. This was typical for photographs of the era when long exposure times made sustained smiles impractical and dignity was conveyed through stillness rather than warmth. But there's something more in these faces, a gravity that goes beyond convention, a weight behind their eyes. They sit before a painted backdrop, classical columns, draped curtains, the standard theatrical props of a Victorian photography studio. A small placard at the bottom of the image reads simply, Savannah, Georgia, 1898. No photographer's mark, no names, nothing else to identify who these women were or why they had come to have their portrait made. The sister on the left appears to be the oldest, perhaps mid-40s. Her face carries the most visible signs of age, of experience, of years that have not been gentle. The middle sister looks slightly younger, her posture perhaps a fraction more upright. The sister on the right seems the youngest of the three, though all appear to be within a few years of each other's age. They share features, high cheekbones, deep-set eyes, full lips. Clearly siblings, clearly photographed together for a purpose. But it's not their faces that draw the eye. It's their hands. All three sisters have positioned their hands in their laps, with their palms turned upward. This is unusual. Women in Victorian-era photographs typically rested their hands palm down or folded them together, poses considered more modest, more feminine, more appropriate for formal portraiture. The etiquette guides of the period were explicit on this point. But these women have deliberately turned their palms toward the camera. Their hands are open, exposed, presented as if they want them to be seen. When Thomas Bennett first examined this photograph in April 2024, this positioning is what caught his attention. Something about the pose felt intentional in a way that studio portraits rarely were. He leaned closer to his screen, reached for his magnifying glass. And then he saw why they had posed this way. Even without magnification, the scars were visible. Deep lines crossing each palm, irregular patterns stretching across fingers and knuckles. Skin texture uneven and mottled, suggesting old burns or wounds that had healed poorly, that had never received proper medical attention. The youngest sister's right hand showed a pinky finger bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken at some point and never properly set. The middle sister's palms bore what appeared to be circular marks, evenly spaced, too regular to be accidental. The eldest sister's hands were the most damaged of all, multiple fingers showing signs of old breaks, a long scar running from her left thumb across her palm to her wrist. These women had chosen to display this damage. They had positioned themselves so that whatever had happened to their hands would be visible, undeniable, preserved forever in silver and light. Thomas felt his breath catch. This was intentional. This meant something. Thomas photographed the image carefully and returned to his office at the Southern Museum of African American History in Atlanta. He uploaded the high-resolution scan and began the standard enhancement work he had performed on thousands of historical photographs, adjusting contrast, sharpening details, revealing what age and fatting had obscured. He worked methodically section by section, the sisters' faces bringing out the fine details of their expressions, their clothing revealing the texture of the fabric, their hands in exhaustive detail documenting every scar, every line, every piece of evidence written on their skin. Then he adjusted the contrast on the background. The painted columns and curtains were standard studio elements, the kind of theatrical scenery that photographers used to create the illusion of grandeur. There should have been nothing behind the three seated sisters except canvas and paint and empty space. But as Thomas adjusted the shadow levels, a shape began to emerge from the backdrop. At first, he thought it was a flaw in the enhancement, a digital artifact, some trick of the software that his eyes were interpreting as meaningful when it was merely noise. He reset the parameters, enhanced again. The shape remained. He switched software, used a different algorithm, enhanced a third time. The shape became clearer. A figure, standing, positioned directly behind the three seated sisters as if she were watching over them, a fourth woman. Her form was semi-transparent, like a double exposure or a ghost caught between worlds. She wore dark clothing similar to the sisters, high collar, long sleeves, period appropriate. Her face was indistinct, features blurred beyond recognition even at maximum enhancement. But her hands were visible at her sides. And when Thomas looked closely, when he pushed the enhancement to its limits, those hands appeared to show scarring too. Thomas turned the original photograph over with trembling hands. On the back, in careful handwritten script that had waited 126 years to be read, he found a note. Clara, Ruth, and Josephine, daughters of Rebecca, rice workers, Oakhurst Plantation, 1852-1865. Free women, Savannah, Georgia, 1898. This portrait commissioned to remember what must never be forgotten. 3 names, 3 sisters. And a 4th name, Rebecca, their mother. Thomas checked the dates. If these women had worked on a plantation from 1852 to 1865, they would have been enslaved children during the final years before emancipation, freed when Union forces arrived and the Confederacy collapsed. But the note said nothing about Rebecca posing for the photograph. It said the portrait was commissioned to remember her. Why would you commission a portrait to remember someone unless they were already gone? Unless they had been lost, and you were trying to preserve something that could not otherwise be preserved. Thomas began searching for records of Rebecca's death. What he found would explain the scars. And it would raise questions about the 4th figure that no expert has yet been able to answer. Thomas contacted the Savannah Historical Society, which had received the photograph as part of a donation of African American historical materials. An elderly woman named Dorothy Williams had passed away in early 2024, and her estate had included boxes of documents and photographs spanning generations. Her great-nephew, sorting through the accumulated belongings of a lifetime, had nearly discarded the cardboard box before noticing the delicate sepia-toned image tucked between layers of yellowed newspaper. He had donated it instead. Thomas requested any additional documentation that might have accompanied the photograph. 2 days later, a package arrived containing materials that had been stored with the image for over a century. Inside were 3 letters, each written in careful script on brittle paper that crackled at the edges. A small leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling, and an envelope containing what appeared to be legal documents of some kind. The letters were dated May 1898, the same month the photograph had been taken. They were signed by Clara, Ruth, and Josephine. The sisters had not simply posed for a photograph. They had created a package of testimony, letters explaining who they were, what they had survived, and why they had chosen to document their scars. They had assembled evidence. This was not just a portrait. This was a case file, a historical record, a weapon against forgetting. Thomas arranged to examine the original letters at the Savannah Historical Society's climate-controlled archive. He brought Patricia Chen, a colleague specializing in 19th-century African-American correspondence, someone who could help him understand the context and verify the authenticity of what they were reading. They sat together in the preservation room, white cotton gloves protecting their hands from the oils of their skin, and carefully unfolded the first letter. It was addressed to whom it may concern. It was signed by Clara. "My name is Clara, and I am writing this to explain the photograph we have commissioned. My sisters Ruth and Josephine and I are free women now, but we were not born free. We were born into bondage on Oakhurst Plantation in Liberty County, and we worked in the rice fields from the time we could walk until Union soldiers came and told us we were free. I was 13 years old when freedom came. Ruth was 11. Josephine was 9. Our mother Rebecca died in the fields when I was 10 years old. She collapsed during harvest season, and the overseer would not let anyone help her until the day's work was finished. By then it was too late. They buried her in the plantation cemetery with no marker, no name, nothing to show she had ever lived. I remember her hands most of all. They looked like ours do now, scarred and broken from the work, from the punishments, from the rice." Thomas set the letter down carefully. Clara had been 10 years old when she watched her mother die. 10 years old when she was prevented from helping, when she was forced to continue working while her mother's life slipped away. 10 years old when she learned that in the eyes of the system that owned her, her mother's labor mattered more than her mother's life. And 36 years later, Clara had commissioned a photograph to ensure her mother would never be forgotten. 3 sisters who survived slavery as children. 3 letters written to explain exactly what they had endured and why they chose to document it. And a photograph meant to honor their dead mother, a woman who had been deliberately erased, buried without even a name to mark her grave. The note on the back says the portrait was commissioned to remember what must never be forgotten. But here's what makes this photograph different from any other historical image Thomas had examined in 15 years of research. When it's digitally enhanced, a 4th figure appears, standing behind them, watching over them. Is the 4th figure Rebecca? Can the dead appear in photographs taken decades after their death? Or is there another explanation, something rational, something scientific, that accounts for what the enhancement reveals? Before we can answer those questions, we need to understand exactly what these women survived. We need to see what they saw. We need to go back to Oakhurst Plantation. We need to read Ruth's letter next, and Josephine's, and then we need to find the records that documented their suffering while it was happening. What those records show is something I wasn't prepared for, and I don't think you will be either. Ruth's letter described the scars in detail. Where Clara had provided context and narrative, Ruth provided evidence, a systematic accounting of the damage done to their bodies and exactly how that damage had been inflicted. The circular scars on my palms came from a punishment when I was 9 years old. I had tried to save a small portion of my food ration to give to a younger child who was starving. When discovered, the overseer heated metal discs in the forge and pressed them against my palms as punishment and warning to others. I screamed until I had no voice left, but I would do it again. The child lived. Her name was Sarah, and she survived to see freedom. That is worth any scar. 9 years old. Thomas looked at the enhanced photograph on his laptop screen. Ruth, now in her mid-40s, a free woman for over 3 decades, still carrying the marks of what a grown man had done to her when she was a child. Her crime had been sharing food with someone who was starving. Her punishment had been torture, and she had chosen to display those scars in this photograph, to show them to the camera, to preserve them as testimony that could not be denied or explained away or forgotten. I screamed until I had no voice left, but I would do it again. Josephine's letter explained why they had chosen this particular pose for the photograph, why their hands were positioned palms up, why they had decided to make the damage visible rather than hide it, as they surely could have done. We know that some people want to forget what slavery was truly like. They speak of kind masters and happy workers, of plantations as grand estates where everyone had their place. These are lies. We have our hands as proof. Every scar tells a truth that words can be twisted to deny. So we had this photograph made, and we positioned our hands so the scars would show clearly. Let anyone who sees this image know what slavery cost us. Let them see the price we paid for the freedom we now claim. Josephine continued, "This portrait is commissioned to remember what must never be forgotten. We remember our mother, Rebecca, who died in the fields with no one allowed to help her. We remember our own childhoods, stolen from us. We remember every mark on our bodies and what caused it. We will not be silent. We will not be erased. We will not allow anyone to tell a pretty lie about what we survived." These women had created testimony, physical evidence that could not be argued away, documentary proof of what they had endured, presented in a format that would last far longer than their own lives. But they had also done something else. They had commissioned this portrait specifically to remember Rebecca, their mother, who had no grave marker, no photograph, no documentation of her existence except as property listed in a plantation inventory. And now, 126 years later, when that photograph is enhanced, a fourth figure appears. Standing behind them, hands at her sides, hands that, when you look closely, appear to show scarring of their own. Stay with me. What Thomas found next, in the plantation records themselves, explains exactly what these women survived as children, and it documents something that happened to their mother that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since I first read it. By minute 15, you'll see the inventory that listed these women as children, with prices, and you'll understand why the fourth figure, if it's who the descendants believe it might be, represents something that shouldn't be possible. Thomas began researching Oakhurst Plantation. The Ashford family papers, the records of the people who had legally owned Clara, Ruth, Josephine, and Rebecca, were split between multiple archives across Georgia. He spent 2 weeks traveling between Athens and Savannah, photographing documents and taking meticulous notes. His colleagues at the museum covered his other responsibilities. He couldn't stop. Once he had started pulling at this thread, he needed to see where it led. The plantation ledgers were coldly detailed. Production numbers, profit margins, expenses for equipment and supplies, and interspersed throughout casual notations about human suffering recorded in the same careful handwriting used for crop yields and shipping schedules, as if bruised bodies and broken spirits were simply another category of business expense. Rice cultivation in the Georgia and South Carolina lowcountry had been among the deadliest forms of agricultural labor in the Americas. The work required enslaved people to stand in flooded fields for hours at a time, often in water up to their knees or waists. Disease was rampant: malaria, dysentery, typhoid, cholera. The mortality rate on rice plantations exceeded that of sugar plantations, which were themselves notorious for working people to death. Children were particularly vulnerable. Many died before reaching adolescence from disease, accident, or exhaustion. Those who survived, like Clara, Ruth, and Josephine, bore permanent physical evidence of the trauma they had endured. Their bodies became their testimony. In the 1860 slave inventory for Oakhurst Plantation, Thomas found them. Rebecca, female, age 28, field hand, rice cultivation. Value $800. Below her name, 3 more entries. Clara, female, age 8, child of Rebecca, field hand. Value $400. Ruth, female, age 6, child of Rebecca, field hand. Value $350. Josephine, female, age 4, child of Rebecca, field hand. Value $300. Children. They had been children. 8 years old, 6 years old, 4 years old, listed as field hands, working in rice fields that killed grown adults, assigned dollar values as if they were equipment or livestock, documented as property in the same ledger that tracked bushels of rice and heads of cattle. Josephine had been 4 years old when this inventory was taken. 4 years old and already categorized as a worker. 4 years old and valued at $300. Thomas had to set the document down. He had to step outside the archive room and stand in the hallway for several minutes, breathing carefully, trying to control the wave of grief and rage that threatened to overwhelm 15 years of professional composure. These were the women in the photograph. These entries described the same human beings who would, 38 years later, sit for a portrait in Savannah and deliberately display their scarred hands to a camera. And Rebecca, their mother, had been 28 years old when this inventory was made. The same age Thomas's sister was now. The age at which a person should be raising children in safety and comfort, watching them learn and grow and become themselves. Not watching them forced into brutal labor, not watching them valued by the pound. The overseer's diary was worse. Marcus Petton had served as Oakhurst's overseer from 1855 until the plantation's collapse in 1865. His daily entries mixed mundane observations about weather patterns and crop conditions with brutal accounts of punishments, accidents, and deaths, recorded in the same flat, matter-of-fact tone, as if describing the repair of farm equipment. August 12, 1858. Rebecca's daughter Clara disobedient during harvest, corrected with 10 lashes, production resumed. Clara would have been 6 years old. June 3, 1859. Ruth attempted to steal food from the kitchen house, administered correction to ensure compliance. These children must learn discipline early or they become unmanageable. Ruth would have been 7 years old. The entry made no mention of the heated metal discs Ruth described in her letter. Either Petton chose not to record that detail, or he considered it too routine to mention. September 14, 1861. 3 field hands lost to fever this week. Rebecca remains productive despite illness, her children adequate workers for their ages. Their mother had been sick, possibly dying, and the only concern documented was whether she could still produce, whether her children were generating enough value to justify the food they consumed. The diary contained lists of punishments categorized by offense. Slowness in work, 5 lashes. Speaking without permission, 10 lashes. Attempting to learn reading, 20 lashes. Attempting escape, 50 lashes or sale. Children received the same punishments as adults, though sometimes, the number of lashes was reduced for those under 10 years old. Sometimes, Thomas found the entry he had been dreading since he first read Clara's letter. September 23, 1862. Field hand Rebecca collapsed during harvest. Unproductive remainder of day. Work continued. Deceased by evening. Burial in Northfield tomorrow. Children returned to work. Rebecca had collapsed in the rice fields during harvest season, the most brutal, most demanding time of the agricultural year. Clara's letter had described what happened next. The overseer would not let anyone help her, not her fellow workers, not even her own children, not until the day's work was finished. By then, it was too late. And the next day, the day after Clara, Ruth, and Josephine watched their mother die, the day after they were forced to continue working while her life slipped away, they were sent back to work. Back to the same fields, back to the same labor that had killed her. The burial location was listed as Northfield. No marker, no ceremony, no record of her humanity except as a notation in an overseer's diary about lost productivity. Deceased by evening. Rebecca had been erased, deliberately, systematically erased, her grave unmarked, her life undocumented except as property, her death recorded only as a production problem to be managed. Her daughters would spend the next 36 years fighting that erasure. They would write letters, they would give speeches, they would display their scarred hands to anyone who would look, and in 1898 they would commission a photograph specifically to remember her. This portrait commissioned to remember what must never be forgotten. And now, when that photograph is enhanced, someone appears to be standing with them. September 1862, a woman named Rebecca collapsed in a rice field. She was buried without a marker. Her children were sent back to work the next day. She was 30 years old. May 1898, 3 women, Clara, Ruth, and Josephine, sat for a portrait in Savannah. They positioned their hands to display the scars they had carried for over 30 years. They wrote letters explaining exactly what had been done to them and why. They commissioned the photograph specifically to remember their mother. This portrait commissioned to remember what must never be forgotten. And when that photograph is digitally enhanced, 126 years after it was taken, a fourth figure appears, standing behind them, watching over them, hands visible at her sides. Is it possible? Can the woman who was buried without a name somehow appear in the photograph her daughters created to ensure she would never be forgotten? Before we try to answer that question, we need to understand who took this photograph. We need to know what the photographer saw and what he sensed that he couldn't explain. His name was Isaiah Crawford, and he called this portrait sacred work. Thomas became curious about who had taken the photograph. Research into Savannah's photography studios in 1898 led him to discover that the image had been taken by a man named Isaiah Crawford, one of the few African-American photographers operating in Georgia at that time. Crawford's story was remarkable in its own right. Born into slavery in 1845, he had learned photography as an apprentice after the Civil War, one of the few skilled trades available to freedmen in the Reconstruction South. He scraped together enough money to open his own studio in Savannah in 1888, 10 years before the sisters would come to him with their request. His studio served primarily black clients, offering them dignified portraiture at a time when many white-owned studios refused to photograph black customers at all, or subjected them to demeaning treatment and insulting poses if they did. Crawford gave his community something rare, the ability to see themselves as they wished to be seen, dignified, proud, worthy of documentation. Thomas located Crawford's business records at the Savannah Historical Society. Among them was a ledger entry for the sisters' photograph, dated April 1898. Portrait of 3 sisters, survivors, no charge, this is sacred work. No charge, sacred work. Crawford had not simply taken a photograph. He had recognized what these women were doing. He had understood the significance of their testimony, and he had refused to accept payment for his role in creating it. In a letter Crawford wrote to a fellow photographer in 1899, Thomas found an explanation of what drove his work. I believe photography has the power to preserve truth in ways that words cannot. When I photograph our people, I am creating evidence of our dignity, our humanity, our survival. The sisters who came to my studio last year wished to document their scars. Some photographers might have refused such a request, thinking it improper or disturbing. But I understood immediately what they were doing. They were creating testimony. They were ensuring that future generations would have undeniable proof of what slavery truly cost. I was honored to be part of that active witness. Crawford had been deliberate about how the photograph was taken. According to his technical notes, he had used specific lighting angles to ensure the scars on the sisters' hands would be clearly visible even in the relatively low resolution of 1898 photography. He had positioned them carefully, suggesting the hand placement that would make the damage most apparent while maintaining the formal dignity of a studio portrait. He had taken multiple exposures to ensure at least one would capture every detail with perfect clarity. And he had kept a copy for himself, something his records show he rarely did. This portrait mattered to him in a way that his other work did not. But there was something else in Crawford's notes, something Thomas almost missed. Unusual light during session. The sisters remarked upon it, said it felt like their mother was in the room. Unusual light, felt like their mother was in the room. Crawford had noticed something during that photography session. The sisters had felt something, a presence, a warmth, something they associated with Rebecca. Did he see the fourth figure? There's no record that he did. The technology to enhance the image and reveal what was hidden in the shadows wouldn't exist for another century. But he sensed something. He documented it. He kept the photograph. He called it sacred work. If you're still watching, you already understand why this photograph matters as historical testimony. 3 women who survived slavery as children, deliberately documenting their scars so that future generations could never deny what they had endured. What you don't know yet is what happens when modern researchers try to explain the fourth figure and why none of their explanations work. Stay with me. In the next section, you'll see the scientific investigation that eliminated every rational theory. And you'll understand why the only explanations left are the ones that shouldn't be possible. Thomas knew he had to investigate the fourth figure rigorously. If it was a photographic artifact, a trick of light, a double exposure, a digital glitch, it needed to be explained. He couldn't present this photograph to the public with an unexplained anomaly and no attempt to account for it rationally. He contacted experts in 6 different fields. None of them could tell him what he was looking at. Dr. Margaret Chen, curator of 19th century photography at the Smithsonian Institution, examined the photograph for 3 weeks. Double exposures were possible with the wet plate collodion process used in 1898. However, they have a distinctive appearance, a transparency across the entire figure, a consistent overlay effect. What we see here is different. The figure has varying opacity, as if partially obscured rather than overlaid. The edges are inconsistent with known double exposure artifacts, and there's no evidence Isaiah Crawford ever used double exposure techniques. I examined 47 of his photographs and found no similar anomalies. I can't explain what this is. Dr. James Morton, a forensic imaging specialist at Georgia Tech, spent 3 weeks trying to prove the figure was a software artifact, something created by the enhancement process itself rather than captured in the original photograph. I tested the enhancement across 6 different software platforms: Photoshop, Lightroom, DxO, Capture One, GIMP, and specialized forensic software used by law enforcement. The figure appeared identically in every version. I then attempted to reproduce the artifact using similar photographs from the same era. I enhanced dozens of images using the same parameters. None of them produced coherent human figures. Whatever this is, it's not something the software invented. It's encoded in the original image data. The enhancement is revealing something that was always present but below the visible threshold. Dr. Amelia Foster, a paper and photograph conservation specialist at the Library of Congress, examined whether physical damage to the photograph could account for the figure. The photograph shows typical aging patterns, minor foxing, slight yellowing, some edge wear. But there's no physical damage in the area where the figure appears. The emulsion is intact. Damage creates random patterns, spots, streaks, fatting. It doesn't create anatomically correct human figures with visible hands positioned at their sides. This isn't damage. Dr. Marcus Webb, a cognitive psychologist at Emory University specializing in perception and pattern recognition, offered one final rational explanation: pareidolia. The human tendency to see faces and figures in random visual noise, the same phenomenon that makes us see shapes in clouds or faces in electrical outlets. He conducted a blind study with 94 participants. He showed them the enhanced image without context, without priming, without any mention of ghosts or figures or mystery. Of 94 participants, 82, that's 87%, independently identified a human figure in the background, without prompting, without being told what to look for. More striking, 71% specifically described it as a woman. 43% noted something unusual about the hands. This consistency is highly unusual for pareidolia, which typically produces more varied interpretations. When people see shapes in clouds, they see different things. Here, almost everyone saw the same thing. I can't rule out shared perceptual bias, but I've never seen this level of agreement in pattern recognition studies of ambiguous images. 6 experts, 6 theories tested. None of them could fully explain what the enhancement revealed. The 4th figure remained. Double exposure, unlikely, pattern inconsistent with known artifacts. Digital artifact, eliminated, figure persists across all software platforms. Physical damage, ruled out, emulsion intact in figure area. Pareidolia, possible but unusual, unexplained consistency of perception. Thomas sat with these findings for weeks. He consulted additional specialists. He ran more tests. He examined the photograph from every possible angle. The 4th figure remained unexplained. The sisters had commissioned this portrait specifically to remember their mother, a woman who was buried without a marker, without a photograph, without any documentation of her existence except as property. And when that portrait is enhanced, a 4th woman appears, standing behind them, watching over them, hands visible at her sides. Is it Rebecca? Science cannot answer that question, but there is someone who might be able to tell us what it means. A living descendant, someone who carries Clara's blood and Ruth's and Josephine's, someone who grew up hearing stories about grandmother Clara and her scarred hands. Her name is Dr. Grace Williams. And when she saw the photograph for the first time, she recognized her own face in it. Thomas began searching for living descendants of Clara, Ruth, and Josephine. The sisters had lived long lives, Clara until 1936, Ruth until 1941, Josephine until 1948. They had married, had children, watched grandchildren born into a world they had helped make possible. Using census records, marriage documents, birth certificates, and modern genealogical databases, Thomas traced the family forward through 126 years of American history. He found dozens of descendants scattered across the country: Atlanta, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Houston. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, artists, business owners. All of them living lives of freedom and opportunity that their ancestors had been denied, that their ancestors had made possible through their survival and their testimony. His first call went to Atlanta, to a 73-year-old retired physician named Dr. Grace Williams. Clara's great-great-granddaughter. Rebecca's great-great-great-granddaughter. When Thomas explained who he was and what he had found, Grace was silent for a long moment. "I've heard stories. My grandmother used to talk about her grandmother Clara. She said Clara had scars on her hands and would sometimes show them to the children, telling them to remember what freedom had cost. But we never knew there was a photograph. We never knew about the letters, and we certainly never knew about what you're describing in the background." Thomas asked if she would be willing to meet, to see the photograph, to read the letters. Grace agreed. 1 week later, Grace arrived at the museum. Thomas had the photograph displayed on a large monitor in a private viewing room, the image enhanced to show every detail: the sisters' faces, their clothing, their hands. Grace stood before it for several minutes without speaking. Her own hands trembled slightly at her sides. Tears began to stream down her face. "That's her," she finally whispered. "That's Clara. I can see my grandmother in her face. I can see myself." She studied the scarred hands, now impossibly clear on the screen. They survived all of that. They survived and built families and lives. We exist because they refuse to be broken. Thomas showed her the letters. Grace read them slowly, carefully, occasionally stopping to wipe her eyes. When she reached Clara's description of Rebecca's death, how she collapsed in the field, how no one was allowed to help, how she was buried without a marker, Grace had to sit down. "I had no idea. The details. We never knew the details. We knew there was suffering, but this." She took a breath. "My grandmother Clara was 10 years old. She watched her mother die, and they sent her back to work the next day. And she lived another 74 years carrying that. And she still found the strength to build a family, to tell her story, to make sure we would know." Then Thomas showed her the enhanced image, the fourth figure. Grace studied it for a long time. Her hand rose to her mouth. She didn't speak for nearly 2 minutes. Finally, "My grandmother, Clara's granddaughter, used to say something when I was a child. She said Clara believed Rebecca was always with them, that she never really left, that wherever the sisters went, their mother was there too. I always thought that was just faith, comfort, a way of dealing with grief that never fully healed. But now I'm looking at this, and I don't know what to think." Thomas asked her what she saw. "I see a woman standing behind my ancestors. I see someone watching over them." She paused. "And her hands, look at her hands. They look like theirs. They look damaged, scarred." Grace was quiet again. When she spoke, her voice was steady but soft. "Whether Rebecca is literally there or symbolically there or not there at all, she's there for me. She's there for our family. Maybe that's what matters." Thomas worked with Grace and other descendants to create an exhibition. When it opened, the museum held a private preview for the family. More than 60 descendants attended, representing 4 generations descended from Clara, Ruth, and Josephine's lines. People who had never met discovered they were cousins. Family stories were shared, compared, verified. Photographs were held up next to faces, tracing features that had passed down through 170 years. They walked through the gallery together, taking in the magnitude of what had been assembled. The letters in protective cases, the plantation records, the overseer's diary, and the photograph enlarged to near life-size, every scar visible. When they gathered before the enhanced photograph, when they saw the fourth figure standing behind the 3 sisters, the room fell completely silent. Among the descendants was Grace's great-granddaughter, a girl of 8 years old. The same age Clara had been when she was listed in a slave inventory, valued at $400, categorized as property. This child, free, educated, loved, surrounded by family, studied the enhanced photograph for a long time. Then she looked up at Grace. "Who's the lady in the back?" Grace paused. We think it might be their mother. But I thought she died before the picture." "She did a long time before." The child considered this carefully. Her face showed no fear, no confusion, only the simple logic of a child working through a puzzle. "Maybe she wanted to be in it too. Maybe she wanted to be in it too." A child's explanation, simple, unscientific, unverifiable, and impossible to disprove. Thomas stood in the gallery one evening after closing, thinking about what the sisters had achieved. Rebecca died 1862. Buried without a marker. No photograph. No documentation of her life. Name nearly forgotten. Story almost lost. Her daughters died 1936-1948. Named headstones in family cemeteries. Portrait preserved for 126 years. Letters documenting their lives and testimony. Names in historical record. Story told and retold across generations. And now something else. The woman who was deliberately erased, buried in an unmarked field grave, documented only as lost productivity in an overseer's diary, may appear in the very photograph her daughters created to honor her memory. The ultimate reversal of erasure. Whether the fourth figure is Rebecca, we cannot know for certain. Science cannot confirm it. Faith cannot prove it. The question may be more important than the answer. But her daughters wanted her remembered. They created testimony to ensure she would not be forgotten. And now, when we look at that testimony closely enough, when we enhance the image they left behind, someone appears to be standing with them. And what of those who inflicted the suffering? What became of the Ashford family, the plantation owners who had listed Clara as property worth $400? What happened to Marcus Petton, the overseer who pressed heated metal into a 9-year-old's hands for the crime of sharing food? The Ashford family lost everything after the war. Oakhurst Plantation was abandoned in 1866, its fields reverting to wetland, its buildings left to rot. The family scattered, their wealth diminished, their name fading from memory. No memorial exists for the plantation today. No descendants carry the Ashford name forward. Marcus Petton disappeared from historical records after 1865. His name appears nowhere after the war's end. No census, no property records, no death certificate. He was erased, just as he had tried to erase the people he brutalized. Meanwhile, Clara, Ruth, and Josephine's descendants now number in the hundreds. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, artists, business owners, scientists, parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. The erasers were erased. The testimony endures. Thomas stood before the photograph one final time. The gallery was dark except for the carefully designed lighting that illuminated the sisters' portrait, the same lighting Crawford had used over a century ago to ensure their scars would be visible. He thought about the journey this image had taken, from Crawford's studio in 1898 to a cardboard box in a Savannah attic, through estate sales and storage rooms and the careless handling of people who didn't know what they had, nearly discarded twice, and now here in a museum seen by thousands. He thought about Clara, Ruth, and Josephine making the deliberate choice to display their damage, to create testimony, to ensure that their mother would not be forgotten. This portrait commissioned to remember what must never be forgotten. They had succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. I've examined this photograph hundreds of times now. I've consulted experts in 6 different fields. I've traced every rational explanation to its end. Here is what I know for certain. 3 women survived slavery's brutality. They were forced to work in rice fields as children. Their mother died in front of them, and they were not allowed to help her. They carried scars on their hands for the rest of their lives. In 1898, they commissioned a portrait specifically to document those scars. They wanted future generations to see what they had endured. They wanted to ensure that Rebecca, their mother, who was buried without a marker, would never be forgotten. And when I enhanced that portrait to see their scars more clearly, I found something else, someone else. Whether she is a photographic artifact, a trick of perception, or something that defies explanation entirely, I cannot tell you. I can only tell you what the enhanced image shows. A fourth figure standing behind three daughters with scarred hands visible at her sides. Rebecca died in a rice field in 1862. Her daughters created this photograph so we would remember her. And somehow, through science or chance, or something we don't have words for, when we look closely enough, she appears to be there with them. The scars are visible. The 1898 photograph remains in the permanent collection of the Southern Museum of African American History. The fourth figure has never been explained. Clara, Ruth, and Josephine's descendants now number in the hundreds. All of them know Rebecca's name. If you have old family photographs with details you've never fully understood, scars, symbols, hidden objects, unexplained figures, I want to hear about them. Every photograph tells a story. Sometimes we just need to look more closely. Share your family's testimony in the comments. Help preserve what might otherwise be lost. And if you want to see more investigations into historical photographs that reveal more than they were meant to, subscribe and turn on notifications. This is not the only photograph with secrets hidden in plain sight. But this is one story, the story of Clara, Ruth, Josephine, and Rebecca, that will never be forgotten.